We will this morning continue in our study of the Gospel of Luke. And we'll pick up about chapter 9 and verse 18. I was thinking when driving back from Missoula on Friday, how we see this develop. In Luke begins, he preaches just to a few individuals here, teaches one or two here, and then there's a group of people, and then there's a bigger group, and then there's a multitude, and there are great multitudes, and it's ever increasing in this number of people who are wanting to see and to know Jesus. I was thinking about that in light of the situations with so many denominations today. Can we imagine what it might be like if all the people who wear the name Christians were Christians? And instead of all these divisions, they were all together as one power working? I mean, it would be every bit as effective as it was there. There's always this world full of opposition set against them. But at every turn, what's happening there? All these people of the same mind following after Jesus. Look at the power that's developing in that. We're always going to have the denominations. But it is sad to see the effect of that, isn't it? That it's really effectively limiting the power, and to many people making it even powerless. All the more reason to learn from these people as the teaching and the healings, the truth continues to be revealed, to see the power in it and to cling to that as well. A little backstory then for this morning. We've seen since the end of chapter 8 that Jesus has begun to commission men to send them to go tell a very specific message. In the closing part of Luke chapter 8, he's sent that former demoniac, the one whom he's made well, told him to go back home and tell them everything that the Lord has done for them. Then in chapter 9, he sends out the 12, sends them on that, what we call the limited commission. And he gave them specific instructions. They're to go to teach about the kingdom and about the healing. You know, it's always very specific. That first, you just go back home and you tell them what the Lord has done. Then the next bunch, you go out to all these towns and villages and you tell them two things about the kingdom and perform these ministries of healing. And then we got to that point last week, where in chapter 9, Jesus sent out these 12 men to serve 5,000 people plus. It's interesting in this, he's developing this whole picture of discipleship. What do you do when I send you out? You talk about only what I tell you to talk about. What do you do when you serve? You serve just in the manner exactly as I told you to serve. And then it's all beneficial, isn't it? That whole crowd was satisfied by that. It's interesting in the feeding of the 5,000 that really the disciples are just the distribution system, aren't they? You see in the reading there, it is the food that God has provided, that Jesus has blessed, that he tells them to distribute. Where did I get that? But, you know, and we see in all this, crucial is the role of the servant, the one who is sent to go out to do exactly what Jesus has said, nothing more, nothing less. Don't teach any more than he said, nothing less. In Luke 9 and verse 16, it says, Jesus kept giving food to the disciples, to quote, to set before the people. You know, it's much like the old saying, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, can you? Well, these people are going to. But The role of the servant or the disciples in this sense continues to develop the picture. What's their job? You just set it before the people. It's up to them whether or not to eat. Just set it before them. And I'm making this point about the disciples, the servant's role, because what if they did not serve the people, as Jesus said? What if the disciples decided, ooh, food, I'm going to sit down here and feed my belly first. Then maybe I'll take a nap. What if they left the people unfed and unsatisfied? Who are the people, who are the men going to blame? The disciples? Who are they going to blame? They're going to blame Jesus, aren't they? You know, they've come, they've heard He provides everything. He's all that they ever need. He satisfies every need. But if He doesn't, you know, who are they going to blame? I was thinking about that even in the context of our work as the church today. Crucial is the work that we're given to do. Crucial is the work that, just as Jesus said it, you set it before the people. When it's not happening, again, who do people tend to blame? We've all heard people say it. Doesn't seem like God's doing anything for me. Well, have we done what we're supposed to do? Set it before the people. It just seems that people are quick to blame God. Oftentimes, perhaps, for what is the failings of men. Just my thought. I mentioned it last week. Can you imagine this hangry crowd? Hungry and angry. Hangry. They're going to blame the master. And it's really this perfect setup for what comes next in this chapter. Starting in verse 18. Who do people say that I am? And then it gets much more specific. It's not about what everybody else is saying. What do you, disciples, who do you say that I am? There's this continuing confusion about who Jesus is. In verses 7 through 9 of this chapter, we first read about it, this discussion about, well, who is this man? Some say he's Elijah, some say he's Moses, some say he's somebody else. And so again, in verse 18, let's begin to read there. And it came to pass, as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, saying, who do the multitudes say that I am? And they answering said, John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the old prophets is risen again. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answering said, the Christ of God. I like the brevity of the answer. Sometimes some translations said, he said, you are the Christ. No, it doesn't even say that. Literally, it's just the Christ of God. I mean, it's so bold. It's just that short. That's all that needs to be said. Verse 21, but he charged them and commanded them to tell this to no man, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and the third day be raised up. And he said to all, if any man would come after me, well, essentially what he's describing there is the same thing that Jesus is going to do. Take up his cross and deny himself. But what's the reason for this discussion here? You know, the disciples have to be able to reason beyond the public view, don't they? They can't stick a finger in the air and test the wind. They can't take public opinion polls. They can't get themselves all discombobulated by what men are saying against Jesus. They've got to be able to make a logical, informed decision for themselves about the identity of Jesus. Because what's going to happen? If they're not convinced of this, what's going to happen? As soon as somebody comes against them, like the Pharisees come against Jesus, they're going to, Julie, you described it once, I think, like blown out of the water, aren't you? I mean, if they don't have that logical, firm conviction of who Jesus is, and somebody says, you must be nuts, they'll be blown out of the water. And so Jesus is first asking, what's the view? What's the buzz on the streets? Well, people are saying all kinds of things, and we know how it works. It all sounds pretty good. It sounds sort of true. Certainly sounds like things they've heard, whether they've heard something about John the prophet, or they remember something about Elijah, or something about the old prophets. I mentioned on Wednesday night that reference to old prophets, they're unnamed. It's talking about those who were written about in the non-inspired books, in the apocryphal books. During that intertestamental period, the people were writing about these old prophets having said this or that. They can't even name them, but still they assume, well, maybe that's who Jesus is. It's interesting in the mention of John, because Jesus is performing miracles, people think he's John. Now, again, how logical is that? Because did John, the prophet, ever perform a miracle? No. But, again, it's one of those things, it sounds sort of right. He did come preaching a baptism for repentance and forgiveness of sin. So, okay, it's Elijah. Well, no matter who they suggest, what's it tell you about the masses? By and large, the masses of the people, they're untaught. They're untaught. They're not understanding either whatever bits and pieces they've heard about John or what they remember about Elijah. But we know still how this works. In the courtroom of public opinion, it's fairly easy sometimes to sway the majority. So it gets much more specific. Forget about what everybody else is saying. Who do you say that I am? Can the disciples make an informed decision? Again, can they buck the popular notions and the opposition? Can they refute the naysayers? And implied in that question is really, who do you know me to be? Peter declares, you are the Christ. Who do you know me to be? And are you willing to stand up and say so? Well, will you declare it? Well, but for the moment, then it's surprising what Jesus says. Okay, Peter, you're exactly right. In your boldness to declare it, you got it exactly right. The Christ of God. But for the time being, don't tell anybody about that. We often wonder about that. Why not tell it if you know it? Remember, he just sent the healed demoniac out, gave him a specific message. You go tell the people what the Lord has done for you. He sent out the disciples there. You go teach about the kingdom and heal the people. Very specific instructions, isn't it? So here, he tells them not to tell this. He warns them to keep it a secret. Sometimes even the things we must know, we must not tell. But why not? Why not? He explains why not there, doesn't he? Because he must yet suffer. I mean, Peter's rightly declared, you are the Christ. What's the proof of that? That he must yet suffer. Suffer by the accusations of those those elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and the third day be raised up. It simply does not fit the eternal plan and purpose of God for them to be out there teaching that at that point. What they need to know is just that fact. Yes, Jill?
He said he came to fulfill all the prophecies, the scriptures, so that's how it had to be in an order of what was said in the Old Testament, right? So that people could then, when they were studying the Old Testament, they would see how all this came into fruition. I mean,
it's everyone, what do they say, something like 300 plus prophecies, considering how you count them? You know, and every one of those, plus what he's about to suffer at the cross, prove without any argument that he is who Peter just declared. You are the Christ of the God, it says literally. And so, don't tell anyone yet. What do we know as well? Well, sometimes it's better for people to learn for themselves, isn't it? How's this movement been increasing? People hear about Jesus, they go to see him, they continue to hear what he says and see what he does, and they're learning this for themselves, aren't they? And oftentimes, that's the best kind of learning. That's how this movement is spreading. Yes, sir?
Also, it's time not yet come.
It's just not time.
If they would declare he was the Christ, it would have changed the time frame, and that wasn't God's plan.
All of those things have to work in that order, in that timely arrangement. I mean, what happens as soon as we sometimes know more than we need to know? You jump with both feet right in the middle of it before you know what's really happening. I never did that, of course. But it's all about God's timing. Again, it's the importance of the disciples going out to teach exactly what Jesus said to teach, to do exactly what he said to do, to trust he is who he is proving to be. But if you need to keep that in confidence for a while, do that as well. Nothing, it's the same thing Jesus did, isn't it? How often he says, I do nothing, I say nothing except that which the Father has given me to say and to do. It's interesting how that picture of discipleship develops. And of course, it would work against God's plan. He must suffer as a man and suffer many, many things. And again, we've already touched on it, but why must he suffer these things? Because that is the verification that he is the Christ. He's not. If he doesn't do these things, if he doesn't fulfill those things, then he couldn't be the Christ. Verse 23 through 27. Much of the issue is at this point, the disciples, Peter speaking for the 12, they know who Christ is. What they don't understand yet is the mission, do they? They know he is the Christ of God. They're still expecting the Christ of God to be a physical earthly king, aren't they? They really don't understand the mission in verse 23 and following. And he said to all, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whosoever would save his life shall lose it, but whosoever shall lose his life for my sake, the same shall save it. For what is a man profited if he gain the whole world and lose or forfeit his own self? For whosoever shall be ashamed of me and of my words, of him shall the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, in the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some of those who stand here who shall in no way taste of death till they see the kingdom of God. As he continues to develop this picture of discipleship, those who hear what he says and do what he says, and nothing more, nothing less, those who are serving as he would send them out to serve and to heal. You know, you see that so far, and you see the crowd developing, and can't you imagine in the crowd there's somebody going, I could do that. I could do that. I think I'll go do that too. You want to go, Jeff? Let's go. You know, really. You know how that crowd mentality works? Look at that. That's neat. These 12 guys get to be with Jesus all the time. I want to do that. 4 things you got to do. What's that? First, you have to have the desire or the wish. Second, you have to deny self. Oh, that gets a little harder now. Third, you got to take up your cross. He's not talking about carrying the beam of wood, is he? He's talking about taking up the instrument, the lifestyle that would bring about your own death. And then follow. So you see, it is a choice. We can make that choice. He's really here, this is a really special call in this sense, that all are called to serve the Lord. But, I mean, he's talking in a sense that, come on, folks, you're going to be the frontline men. It doesn't mean that others who aren't on the front line can't serve the Lord, but serve in some other ways. They just need to understand the degree to which they are about to suffer. And there's a lot of people who serve the Lord and serve Him well that, you know, aren't out there where they're about to get killed. But in this sense, I'm bringing this up because sometimes preachers do it, and I've seen it done in preaching school. If you're not on the front line, then you're kind of shamed, you know. You're not really serious about it. We need a lot of people in the rank and file serving as well. And I say it in particular to that second requirement about denying self. What's he talking about? You got to get rid of the I want attitude. Well, I'd rather want this, you know, even if it's just a temporary thing, like, well, you mentioned it last week, Jill, you know, let me go home and say goodbye to my family. What? Wait a minute. That's not part of the equation. When Jesus says go, we go now, and everything we want is set aside. It happened in that same way. You know, when Jesus had taken these 12 men to Bethsaida, what was the plan? We're going to go up there and we're going to rest. We're going to spend some time together. We're going to recuperate. And what did they have to do? Deny themselves. Suddenly, you had to abandon the plan to serve the people. But this denying themselves, you know, these 12 men are really going to receive the brunt of the persecution, aren't they? 11 of the 12 are going to die very grotesque, strange ways. Sawn in half and hung upside down and all the rest. You know, that takes a special kind of a desire and a special degree of self-denial to serve in a way that you can know going into it, you're going to die for this. Still, I would say, you know, don't let anyone shame you for not being one of those on the front line. I mean, even Jesus is going to need some help carrying his cross up to the top of the hill, isn't he? Well, what else? Take up that cross daily. take up that instrument of death. Well, I desire to do it. And then I will deny self, and I will take up this cross. And it seems if you've done three things, then that's enough. Why does he tag on to the end of this, and follow? Because what happens? Somebody's all gung-ho about it today, and then they prefer to sleep in tomorrow. I mean, it is a special degree of devotion, just as Jesus has been demonstrating. We came up here to this place to rest. You're not getting to take your afternoon nap. Sorry, Gary, we got to skip our afternoon nap. I'll not miss it today. But really, it's that kind of whatever is needed for teaching and serving the people, that has to come first. And so you may be gung-ho today, but you need to be gung-ho every day. Yes, Jim?
I think that's the discipline and the teaching that I learned from Jeannie. It was daily. It was, you couldn't make plans. You didn't get really a break. And you had to be determined. And it wasn't going to be something that was going to go away in a week. You know what I mean? It was lifelong for her.
So has that been beneficial for you in your Christianity?
Absolutely, because everything you talk about, picking your cross up daily and following him, because when I look back on everything that I didn't know what to do with Jeannie and how God led me, how God put me in different places, if I was to go back, if I would have known at the very moment that she was born, everything that was going to take place, it would have been so overwhelming.
You would have made a different decision if you knew beforehand everything that was going to be required over the next 34 years.
And so it's just, and she was such a blessing because her attitude, I just can't get over. When I think about Jeannie still, and if I start having a woe is me type thing or something, you know what I'm saying? Her attitude was so amazing, and she loved the Lord with every part of her being. What an inspiration she was.
I don't mean to mean anybody, but you know how those times are.
Yes.
We've been there. If you have this one terrible day, you're not so gung-ho when you wake up the next morning, are you? Well, I think I'm not going to face that again. So, well, that's what these men are given to face.
Right, exactly. And they have to get up every day with that determination, attitude, and devotion. And then keep remembering the prize. Keep remembering down the road. Don't get caught up in that just what's happening right then. Look to the future.
And another aspect of it too, these men have been raised up in all this Judaism, and they've seen, the status quo of Judaism, and how men, they know God's word, they claim to love God, but they're going to push their own agendas. What can true disciples not do? We call it today change agents. Those who want to promote women in the pulpits or the alternative lifestyles and all that kind of stuff. And they're willing to push that. True followers of Jesus, just don't do that. They can't do that. And that's really the distinction made in the calling of these 12 men, the example of them. That they are going to be betrayed, just as Jesus was. But I was thinking about Judas Iscariot. Isn't it strange? That man had been given the same measure of power and authority as the rest of them. But he had his own agenda, didn't he? And he was pushing that. He was even arranging that. by not denying self. And still, what is the end of his life? Not a death with hope, but a death in tragedy. And all of this really, I think, needs to be seen in its proper perspective. That what these men are giving up now, Jesus even alludes to it. What are they going to see in the future when Christ comes again? Give up whatever we want to do now, knowing we will be saved and greatly, beyond measure, prospered when he comes in glory. Still, again, it's to this point in verse 27. Till they see the kingdom of God. Till they see it. In the following verses then, in 28 through 31, they've had a week roughly to ruminate over all this. All they've been seeing and hearing about specifically what to teach and who to serve and how to serve, what to talk about, what not to talk about. Everything has to work according to God's plan. They've had it says some 8 days to think about it. And they've been thinking about, okay, what is my desire? What is the decision? What is the degree of my devotion? That's worth 8 days of thinking about, isn't it? What am I really, truly going to do about Jesus? And particularly what's required of them in keeping God's Word. In that passage that we read there, it all boils down to this matter of shame. He speaks of it right there in the middle of it. Now, it's easy for somebody to say, I want to do that. I want to follow him that way. Really? Why a sudden mention of shame? Because really, as I mentioned, somebody can be gung-ho today and get out there tomorrow and face the opposition and whoa, I don't think so. It's just not going to work, is it? I mean, up to this time, the crowds have been increasing, the multitudes are increasing. Everybody's either amazed or some are absolutely opposed, but there's this strong conviction one way or the other. What happens if they go out there and their conviction is, I don't think so. Oh, I know he's the Christ, but am I really going to say so? I'll admit there's been times when I've hedged my bet, so to speak. And I don't think I'm the only one. Well, I'll say this much because, has anybody else ever done it? I'll say this much because, at least that they're not going to come against me. I mean, it comes to teaching about the kingdom, and when he says that, he's talking about all that is required to enter the kingdom, how you're going to live as citizens of that kingdom, who's large and in charge above you. And that's where people, I don't think so. It is a special degree when he's talking about these who are going to be taking the brunt of that. We got just a few minutes. We come then to that other matter that even moves further along the discussion. First he asked them, who do they say that I am, and who do you say that I am? And now it's going to be miraculously and powerfully demonstrated to those three men that Jesus takes to the mountain. Verse 28, and it came to pass about 8 days after these sayings, that he took with him Peter and John and James and went up into the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his clothing became white and dazzling. And behold, there talked with him 2 men, who were Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his decease, which he was about to accomplish at Jesus. They're talking to Jesus about his death that is very near. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. What's to this point still the problem with what these 3 disciples see? They still see Moses and Elijah as being equals to Jesus. They know he's the Christ, but Moses and Elijah must be every bit equal to him. And again, when you talk about setting aside your own plans and doing or building the things you want to build, what happens to that? You better scratch that. What do they want to do when they see this? Let me find my place again. And it came to pass, verse 33, as they were parting from him, Moses and Elijah, Peter said to Jesus, Master, now this is ironic, isn't it? He just said Master, but what's his response? It is good for us to be here, and let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, but not understanding what he said. And while he said these things, there came a cloud and overshadowed them, and they feared as they entered into the cloud. And the voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my Son, my chosen. Hear him. And when the voice came, Jesus was found alone. And they held their peace and told no man in those days any of the things which they had seen. Well, he just affirmed what he told them earlier. You don't tell this right now, but even though it's been proven to you right now, they've seen it for themselves. We don't have much time to get into this, but what's the message? You heed only the word you receive from Jesus. It's not that the other words weren't effective and good for their time. You heed only his words. You deny all your own plans. You know, Moses and Elijah, they've got to come to understand, are not the equals of Jesus. The law of Moses will no longer be in effect. The word of the prophets is being fulfilled. All that is done. What's left is what matters. And he said to him already more than once. It's all a matter now. In whom are you going to trust? To whom are you going to listen? Who is it? Whose word is really among mankind the final word from God? Those other men were no doubt great men, but they were imperfect, weren't they? They were mere mortals.
Paul,
yes, sir.
Question for you. I know oftentimes we think about Christ's death on the cross being the point in time where the covenant changed from old to new. Is it possible that this was the moment in time when the covenant changed? From now on, you're only my son. Now, there was still fulfillment that needed to take place with the crucifixion
sure.
and the resurrection. But is it possible that this is the moment in time on this earth when the covenant officially changed?
Pictured as changing. It would still take the actual blood to establish the new one, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and that's what I mean, there's still things that needed to be fulfilled
Yeah.
to make it valid.
Well, in effect, what we know, as soon as Jesus said it, it's accomplished. They certainly need to, before the new covenant comes, they need to really have a strong sense of what's going to change. And Jesus, in effect, has told them that day, this better change in you right now. And perhaps that's the sense of, you know, come on, guys, you're sort of my three kingpin here. And if you're going to truly be my frontline men, some things got to change in you right now. You're going to see the kingdom, but how do you know you're going to be in the kingdom? How do you know to worship as the kingdom will worship? Not all these other men. And it really does. Before these men go out to teach the kingdom and preach the gospel, they really do. It's got to change in them that day. That all has to go away. And in that sense, I believe you're right. You know, it's time for you. What's past is past. Now, I'm all that matters.
This is the first time God said it.
Yeah.
Jesus had been alluding to what was coming.
Yeah.
And the fulfillment he was going to bring.
The voice out of heaven said.
But this is the voice.
Yeah. And
where he said, this is my son. He's the only one you listen to now.
that's right.
Well, this is the third time that God spoke audibly where men heard it.
Mm-hmm.
But this time, these disciples are going to be the ones taken up this after the cross. And he told them, you better hear him.
Well, again, you know, if we think back to where we started today, you know, who do the multitudes say that I am? Well, the multitudes are filled with hogwash sometimes. You know, you can't be influenced by that. They can't be influenced by what the high priest and the scribes and the Pharisees are binding on them. There's nothing else that matters but what Jesus said. Sounds simple for us to say it. It's not quite so simple to live it, is it?
Can you imagine hearing that from God?
Yeah.
This is my son, hear me.
Which is as much as God saying, it's me. What'd you have, Jill?
Well, I was just thinking, they fell asleep here, you know, and then they fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the whole thing here is be alert.
Yeah.
He's telling them to be alert, pay attention. Pay attention.
Because if they really don't get this,
Right.
it goes back to that point when they are out there facing the conflict. If they really don't get this, they're going to be ashamed of what's required to be citizens of the kingdom, aren't they? And a lot of people are. I hope it's worthwhile to reconsider these things. Thank you for your involvement.